In this video, we're going to have a look at the marking gauge. So we have here in front of us a marking gauge, and we're going to have a look at how we use it. Okay, so we have, first of all, a thumb screw here. We have a stock, which can be loosened by loosening the thumb screw. And we have the stem, which is the part that runs the full length of the marking gauge. Okay, and we have this little point here, which is called the spur. So on this side of this marking gauge, we have one spur. On the other side of this marking gauge, we have two spurs. Okay, we actually call this a mortise gauge. So we use this when we're creating and marking out a mortise and tenon joint. Okay, so what I'm going to show you is 3 ways how to set up your marking gauge. Now we're going to talk through the first option on how we can set up our marking gauge. Okay, so I'm going to set my marking gauge to help me mark out a corner rebate joint. I have my piece of wood here where I've started to mark out the corner rebate joint. And I need to come in and mark out the section that's going to be used for the marking gauge to mark out the halfway point here. So the first thing I need to look at is the thickness of my wood. So I'm taking my steel rule into here, and my steel rule is telling me that that is about 17 mil thick. Okay, so for this particular joint, I'm wanting half of that size to be set on the marking gauge. So half of that is 8.5, so 8.5. So I'm going to take my marking gauge. I'm going to loosen off the thumb screw so the stock can freely move along the stem, okay, like that. I'm then going to take my steel rule, position it onto the stock, and then push with my index finger and my thumb, and push it along until I get to the size 8.5. So that's me at 9 there, and then that's me at 8.5 there, okay. So this is the fiddly bit. You now want to position it like that, lay your steel rule down, and without moving the stock within that period, tighten up the thumb screw. And now we've set up the marking gauge to 8.5 mil, ready to scribe onto our piece of wood. So we're now going to have a look at our second option on how to set the marking gauge. So in our workshops here, we have something called a marking gauge jig that's set up on the sides of our toolboxes. So we have various common sizes for our marking gauges along the edge there. All right. So like before, I'm going to loosen off my thumb screw, ensuring that the stock can move along the stem. And then I'm going to take my spur here, and I'm going to line it up with 8.5, because that's the measurement I need, that's the size I need. So I'm going to place the spur into there. Okay. I'm then going to slide along the stock to the edge of the toolbox like that, making sure it's nice and tight, nice tight fit. And then from there, I can tighten up my thumb screw like so. And now that is the second way you can set up your marking gauge. This is also a really, really useful tool to check if you accurately measured or accurately set your marking gauge at the start using your steel rule. So if I did the first option and used my steel rule to set the distance, I want to double check I've got that right. I can then come in here, place the spur into the 8.5, making sure there's no gap between the stock and the edge of the toolbox, and that checks to me that that is good to go and ready to start marking out my corner rebate joint. We're now going to have a look at the third option on how we can set our marking gauge. So for this one, what we can do is loosen off our thumb screw, ensuring that the stock is freely moving slightly. Okay. And then we're going to guess roughly where the middle is. So I'm going to pop the marking gauge onto the wood about there. Okay, I think that looks roughly about the middle, making sure the spur is roughly around the middle of the piece of wood. Okay, because we're wanting half the distance there. I'm going to tighten up the thumb screw a little bit there, make a wee indent in the wood, just a little dot. Okay, and then I'm going to come around and move the marking gauge to the other side of the piece of wood, and I'm going to make a wee indent there. So we can see when I make a little indent there, those two dots aren't quite matching up, so I'm not quite there yet. So I'm just going to tap very gently on the marking gauge and try again to find that centre. So I'm going to make another wee indent in the wood there, rotate round, another wee indent there to try and match up these dots. Still not quite there. Okay, so I'm just going to give a wee tap on the stem just to move the stock ever so slightly. Okay, so that looks like it's almost there now. I'm going to come in and make a little dot in the wood with the spur, come around to the other side, make a little dot in the wood, and now we can see those dots are lining up. Okay, so I'm now confident that that is the centre of the wood because it is marrying up in the centre on both sides of the wood. So I can now tighten up that thumb screw a bit more, making sure it's secure, and that is you ready to go to mark out your corner rebate joint or any other joint you may need to use the marking gauge for. Now we've correctly set our marking gauge to the correct distance, and we've discussed the 3 different options how you can check that. We're going to actually use the marking gauge to mark in where I want my line to be for this corner rebate joint to allow us to mark out the waste wood. So, taking my marking gauge, I'm going to bring the stock up against this side of the wood. Okay, so on my face side. I'm then going to take my spur and I'm just going to gently press it into my marked line I did earlier. Okay, so I'm just putting in a wee dot there. Okay, and that's going to act as a nice little stopping part for me. Okay, so it's going to stop the marking gauge and not go into the nice bit of wood I want to keep later, which will form the rest of my project. So I'm then going to take my stock again onto the edge of the wood, making sure you hear that noise. There's no gaps in here. Okay, nice and flush against the wood. And the movement I'm going to do is pressure down and drag back. So I'm putting some pressure down and twisting the marking gauge and dragging towards myself. So we've got the marking gauge on here. I'm going to engage the spur by twisting it round onto the wood, and then I'm just going to drag down until I hit that wee bump into there. So that's hit my little stop, and it's not going to go past that line. I've now marked out one side of my corner rebate joint. I can now rotate the piece of wood in the vise so I can mark along the end grain. Now, following the same process, I want to take my stock against the piece of wood, and then I'm going to do the same motion by rotating the spur into the wood and then applying force downward while dragging back to me. Now, this may take a few times to mark out because it is on the end grain. It is a bit trickier, so you've got to be patient with this and make sure you apply enough pressure in the correct direction to ensure you get a nice, straight, accurate line. And allows us to scribe along the end grain like this. Okay, so I'm going over this quite a few times. Because it's end grain, it's a bit hard to mark this out and scribe this out. But I'm now happy that I've scribed enough on the end grain here to see where my joint's going to start and end. I can now rotate the wood in the vise again for my last joint, my last section to scribe, I should say. Again, I'm going to take my spur. I'm going to line it up with the pencil line here. I'm going to bring this piece of wood out the vise just a tiny bit more. I'm going to line up my spur with the pencil line. I'm going to come in and make a little indent just above that pencil line. And this is going to act as a nice little stop for me when I drag my marking gauge down. I'm then going to place the marking gauge up at the end grain here. You can see how that's lining in nicely to the scribe section on the side of the end grain. Again, making sure my stock is hard up against the wood on its face side, applying pressure down and twisting, and I'm going to just push the marking gauge away from me. And as I do that, and I move down, I can then feel it stop into that little hole I made at the start, so it protects the rest of the wood that I want to keep. And that's how you successfully use a marking gauge to mark out a joint, in this case a corner rebate joint. And the last little thing I like to do once I've done that is come in with my sharp pencil and outline the area that I've went around scribing with the marking gauge. And then lastly, I'll come in and mark out my waste wood. This then allows us to move on to cutting out the waste wood accurately.